Hey everyone, so this is number 2 of our notes on chapter 8, and we left off here talking about the cell cycle. So um, where we're going with is starting to understand how the stages of this cell cycle are under control. And so when you talk about the nucleus controlling cell activities, the nucleus, along with hormones released by by various glands, uh, lead to an overall control of the cell cycle itself. And so there's a number of things that influence cell division within any group of tissues of which cell are made of cells, right? So first off, the first one is what is referred to as an anchorage dependency. Anchorage dependency. Dependence, let's put, which is essentially that any cells dividing must be anchored to some sort of surface, a substrate, and unless they are, it's that they just don't go through the cell division. Within our own bodies, we have what is referred to as an extracellular matrix, and this is a network of proteins that link and bind tissues together. It's one of the key components that scientists have spent many years researching in the world of growing organs. So if you've ever checked out that, it's a very interesting topic, but one of the primary components in terms of harvesting cells from an individual and using those cells to grow entire organs, one of the key components is having a scaffold, almost like a network. Think of a maple tree in the wintertime without any leaves on it. And there's this sort of network and scaffolding to which cells can attach to. So that's one key factor about influencing cell division. The next one is that cells have what we call a contact inhibition, or I think your book calls it a density, well, similar to this, density dependent inhibition, contact inhibition, or density dependent inhibition, in which it's a control mechanism that when cells are attached to a substrate and they start dividing, that eventually, as the cells begin to come into contact with each other, there will be signals that arrest cell division. Signals arrest cell division. And lastly are a group of proteins, including growth factors. And these proteins, much like hormones, cause these signal transduction pathways that we talked about before. And these signal transduction pathways stimulate cell division, and that can be driven by neighboring cells. So neighboring cells that release these growth factors, and growth factors bind onto the receptors of neighboring cells. And just like we talked about, these integral proteins that span are connected to other molecules on the inside, which can lead to a cascade of events. And eventually, what makes it sort of this signal transduction pathway, we can have these cellular responses, but more specifically, triggering the DNA within the nucleus and affecting its gene expression. So remember, we talked about how the DNA is the information and the code to make proteins. Well, what would happen is these growth factors would influence the expression of specific genes that are related to making proteins responsible for cell division. And that'll become a little bit more clear here when we look at the diagram down below. So growth factors also signal cell cycle checkpoints, okay? And so in this diagram down below, here's our cell cycle with our G1 phase, right? That goes into our S phase, and then our G2, and so on. So just a different visual for cell cycle, but what's important is at different points, so here we can see a G1 checkpoint. And so this is where a cell is moving from one stage of the cell cycle, G1, into the second stage, S phase. And remember that S phase is where DNA synthesis occurs. That's where the S comes from, DNA synthesis. And in a sense, this is DNA replication, right? Where the DNA is getting copied. So remember that all that DNA replication happens prior to mitosis actually occurring, right? So if we scroll back up here and we're talking about interphase, this S phase is occurring prior to mitosis. So all the DNA is copied before a cell starts splitting. And so there are specific proteins that and environmental conditions that signal a cell to move into the S phase or not. So a cell's not going to go through DNA synthesis if the proteins and enzymes required for DNA synthesis aren't there. There's another checkpoint here at the end of G2, so G2 checkpoint, in which then again, if the DNA is all replicated and the environment is favorable, then the cell would enter into that mitotic phase. And finally, a third checkpoint, and if you remember your stages of cell division, a metaphase checkpoint, this is where all the chromosomes are lining up down the middle. And so if this hasn't occurred in an appropriate manner, then that whole process would be aborted, so to speak, and the cell wouldn't go through it. So it's amazing the number of things that go on in a cell to ensure things happen in an orderly and correct fashion. And this is all controlled by many of these growth factors that signal the cell cycle through signal transduction pathways. Yeah, and I just indicated a few main things here in which events that are occurring in those different checkpoint phases to ensure the cell moves through the cell cycle into the next section. So one important thing to note here is this G0 phase, which actually is kind of an extension. I don't think I have it on here, but essentially at this point, if the cell's conditions, the environment is not favorable, if the proteins required for DNA replication are not present, then a cell can depart from the regular cell cycle growth and division. And that can be a temporary or a permanent thing. Some cells that virtually don't divide for your entire life practically are in this G0 phase permanently. And that's where we run into issues of nerve damage and spinal cord injuries, in which we've damaged cells that won't replicate and therefore can't repair the damage, right? Sometimes it's due to external factors in which just certain cells go into this phase temporarily. And then if the environment, the conditions change, and it's more favorable, they will re-enter into the cell cycle of regular growth and division. All right. So moving on to the next page is a look at the cell cycle and how the cell cycle relates to the death of the cell, and in fact is programmed within the DNA itself as well. So apoptosis is very much a normal, orderly process in the life cycle of cells, and it literally is kind of a programmed cell death, which is kind of a good thing in the sense when cells aren't doing what they need to be doing and performing their functions, then it makes sense to get rid of them, so to speak, right? So a lot of that programmed cell death would be due to external changes or internal changes within the cell's environment, and that could lead to triggering of programmed cell death or apoptosis. So some of the external cues could be a result of failure of cells to make connections. So making cell-to-cell connections with neighboring cells, much like in neuron development. And this is a huge part. I don't know exactly if I'm 100% correct in this, but in early brain development of children, many neurological pathways are being built, and if certain neural pathways fail to make connections to other neighboring neurons, it will lead in a programmed cell death, and this is what causes reinforcement of certain pathways and sort of the decreased reinforcement, right, or the diminishment of other neural pathways, and why it's so important to, raise your children from a wide variety of stimuli to build these various neural pathways, right? Other things, wrong location, no cell-to-cell recognition via, if you remember, our receptor proteins on the surface of our cells, or specialized proteins literally involved in cell-to-cell recognition. It's one of those things we'll look at as to why you can't receive, say a skin graft, or you can't receive an organ from just anybody, because those individual cells that make up the tissues of that organ have specific proteins. And if those proteins aren't similar to the proteins of other cells, your body recognizes them as foreign and basically mounts an immune response, which kind of leads us to the next thing. So, signaling proteins. These can affect our immune responses. So, specialized white blood cells of our immune system, if they encounter virus-infected cells, will release signaling proteins, which can then cause the infected cell to release its own hydrolytic enzymes from, if you remember, lysosomes, right? And that's where lysosomes can play a role in the process of apoptosis, and leads to literally autolysis, so the digesting of the entire cell. Okay, on the internal side, so the top two refer to external conditions that lead to programmed cell death, and on the internal, one being simply the DNA is damaged. All right, and so if it's damaged to a degree where it can't produce proteins that would help to repair, then apoptosis would begin, and programmed cell death would occur. Now, sometimes there's appropriate apoptosis in the normal developmental conditions in certain cells. So a great example of this is if you look at developing embryos in the womb, you can see fetuses with webbed digits. But specific conditions within the cell, within the developing digits, trigger apoptosis, and specific enzymes are produced that literally break down the tissues forming between digits, causing us to be born with normal digits. There's genetic defects where this doesn't occur, and sometimes fetuses are born, babies are born with webbed digits. It's an easy surgical fix, and so you don't see it very often, but it can result. And then inappropriate apoptosis. So by appropriate, we're saying like this normal process by which cell death occurs, creating our digits. Inappropriate apoptosis is essentially genetic defects, like in, say, Huntington's disease, in which you get apoptosis occurring where it should not. So basically, this is neurons that undergo apoptosis when they shouldn't. When they should not. Okay, so ultimately in the process of the cell cycle, cells growing, carrying out normal functions, undergoing cell division, and this life cycle of apoptosis being part of that process, and cell death, there's this balance of sorts, right? A homeostasis between cell reproduction and cell apoptosis that leads to a healthy individual. And in some cases, the balance doesn't exist and problems arise. And that ultimately is the case with cancer. So I'll stop there, and that will be our next video.